Good late morning. Hi, everybody. Hella invites you to even come closer if you want. She promises not to ask you any questions, and I can vouch for her. She doesn't bite. So welcome to section 9A, Co-Creating the Future When Meeting Self-Harm with a New Perspective. It's a really great pleasure to introduce our presenter. I've known Hella from my work here in DBI for the past, I guess, 18 months or 2 years. And so Hella Sellings works as a developmental consultant with the special focus on co-creation of knowledge and knowledge sharing from her base at CDH in Denmark. Hella is author to several articles with a focus on tactile communication and congenital deafblindness, partner competencies, self-harming, and transfer from knowledge to action. She's worked in the field of deafblindness since 2000. She has a background in communication from the University of Allenborg, and later she finished her Master's of Science in Communication and Deafblindness from the University of Groningen in the Netherlands in 2011. Hella is a member of the Nordic Network on Tactile Language, the DBI Communication Network, and the Scientific Committee of this DBI World Conference. So it's without further ado that I introduce you to our next presenter, Helen.
Hello. So thank you, Jerry. Oh, there's a glass table down here, so I was just wondering if there was something to put on. So it is a little scary for me to be up here in this big hall. So thank you very much for the introduction there, Jerry. I want to talk about self-harming or self-injuring behavior, as it's called here in the States and Northern America. First, I want to introduce you to my co-partner, my co-author, Lone Rømer Jensen. She is not able to be here because she's on vacation in Japan with her family. But I hope that one of you will take a picture so that I can text it to her afterwards. I think she would appreciate that a lot. So why do we focus on self-harm? Actually, it started with a wondering. Why do children, grown-ups with deafblindness sometimes harm themselves? Why do they do that, and why do they continue to doing it? We really wondered about that. What is in it for them when they turn to self-harming? And then we started to I forgot to shift this one. And then we started to look into some Danish literature. What did the Danish literature say on self-harming when we talked about people with disabilities and no use of a conventional language? What did the research say about people with deafblindness and self-harming? And I have to be honest, it said almost nothing, or at least a very little. In most of the research in the Danish literature, it just said that self-harming is a part of challenging behavior. It's a sub-behavior of challenging behavior. And it said that people with disabilities often tend to harm themselves more than people without any disabilities. And that was it. Then we looked into the literature, international literature, and it gave us a little more, but mostly about the prevalence of self-harming behavior with people who were disabled and no language, but not a lot on what to do with it. There was one study that said it is not enough to give them a ball coffin or something, you know, you put a duvet with balls. It's not enough, and that was it. So also we thought that in the field of practice, at least in the Danish field of practice, but I also know that a colleague of mine in Sweden, she also said that there is a lack of systematic observations and analysis of this self-harming behavior in practice. So it is going on there, but they know who the people who self-harm are, but they didn't really organize the knowledge that they had about it, so that it was very hard to do an analysis on it. And Lona and I, we said to each other, well, we need to take self-harm seriously, and we need a way to find new actions for staff, because I work as a staff development consultant as well. So I meet a lot of staff who are very, very frustrated when they meet self-harming behavior because they didn't know what to do with it. So often they just didn't do anything or try to prevent it, and that's the two things that is very, very difficult to do. Prevent it or stop it or just ignore it, because then you feel that you have lost your ability to act on it. So staff was frustrated, and then Lona and I, we really wanted to give people with self-harm, with self-harming behaviors and deafblindness a voice. We wanted them to speak for themselves what was important for them since they used self-harming behavior. So let's look a little more into the literature study. This will be very short, but some of the prevalences on the literature study showed that 10% of people with development disabilities risk to develop self-injurious behaviors. So 10%. And it also showed that significant or cognitive impairment increases the risk of self-harm compared to mild to moderate cognitive impairment. So the more challenges that you are in life in all ways, helping yourself, communicating, getting around, do stuff that you really like, the higher risk you are in getting or develop a self-harming behavior. And then it also showed that people with repetitive, mononomous, and not varied language users are more challenged with self-harm than people who use a more varied and non-repetitive language. So there's something about this communication issue and self-harming, but that is not all of it. So research does not say that people with communicative challenges have self-harming behavior, but there might be something on it. Then when we looked into the literature study, all of it was about the pathological self-harm. So self-harm was considered as a kind of a suffering. And there was these 4 types of self-harming behavior or self-injuring behavior. So it could be serious and life-threatening self-harm. It could be impulsive self-harm, compulsive self-harm, or stereotypical self-harm. So the serious self-harm is fierce and can be life-threatening. So here we find various forms of disfiguration, amputations, or destructions of body parts. For instance, sticking pointed objects into the eyes. In the impulsive self-harm, it's caused superficial damage to the skin, for instance, cutting, burning oneself, and this is considered kind of be self-effect regulating. And that is, I guess, when we look into self-harm, one of the most researched self-harms, because this is what young people often do, use this impulsive self-harming when they cut themselves or burn themselves or something. And then the compulsive self-harm is typically associated with psychological disorders and is characterized by being compulsive and ritualized habits of actions. For instance, a patient's urge to bite his nails or pick his skins or hair or something like that. And then the stereotypical self-harm as the last one is often related to people with developmental disabilities, and it is described as monotonous and rhythmic patterns of self-harm. For instance, you hit your head, or you bang your head against something, or bite yourself for poking your eyes and stuff like that. So in Denmark, we have this professor, Bo Møhl. He wrote a very thick book about self-harm, and he defines non-life-threatening self-harm as direct, intentional, self-inflicted, and social unacceptable destructions of body tissue. But Lone and I, we asked ourselves, is it possible to change the perspective? What happens if we change from the perspective of suffering and start to think of self-harm as strategies for regulating yourself? So it's kind of coping strategies. And who has actually the problem when it comes to self-harm? Is it the person who self-harm, or is it us who is witnessing it? And what happens if we think and we go with the basic assumption that a person is always doing his best? No matter who we are always doing his best. So what happens if we start to consider the self-harming as a coping strategy, understanding that this is the best thing the person is able to do right in the moment? What happens then? Can we look at it in that way? So we decided to do that, and we came up with this definition. So we said that self-harming is a coping strategy for restoring inner balance. It is a coping strategy recognized by repetitive patterns of actions that result in body or tissue damage, either directly or over time. Actions which can be experienced as problematic in the relation. So this is a different definition on self-harm. In our definition, we understand and acknowledge self-harm as a coping strategy for restoring inner balance, and it might not be a good or an appropriate strategy. But still, it is a strategy and not just only behavior. So when we use strategy, we use the actual strategy, the actual action, because it makes sense to us here and now. It's meaningful to us. So the person who harmed himself, because the self-harm is meaningful for him in some way. Unfortunately, the result of the self-harm is that body tissue is damaged. As Møhl, the professor who gave the other definition, we also think that self-harm is self-inflicted damage to body tissue, but in relation to people with development disabilities, we do not believe that the self-harm necessarily is intentional. So they do not do that on purpose. We therefore don't believe that it is coming from a desire or a wish to harm oneself or inflict pain on oneself on purpose. And thus the person does not use the self-harm consciously, but it still emerges, as also in the cases of the impulsive self-harms, from a need to endure an inner tension or to change an experience of imbalance or discomfort. And in this way, the self-harm becomes a bodily expression of the inner state. And even though it is a bodily expression and it tells the outside something about how the person is feeling, the self-harm as an expression is not intentionally directed at the outside world. So, as previously mentioned, stereotypical self-harm is described as rhythmic, monotonous, and repetitive movements. And when the body tissue is damaged through frequent and repeated impact on the same place, we can talk about self-harm as a non-direct nature. The body tissue is damaged as a result of the repeated strain over time and not directly here and now, for instance, in the cutting, unless the person is, really harming herself very, very bad. And then Møhl, the other guy, he defined self-harming behavior as social unacceptable. So it is also, as I said before, it is considered as a subcategory of challenging behavior in the literature. But we have a Danish psychologist, and his name is Bo Heilskov, and he puts an end to the common understanding that the problem lies within the person who has the behavior. And thus we move it into a more interpersonal and much more dialogical understanding that the challenging behavior is a problem for both parties. And when it is a problem, and when self-harm is problematic and socially unacceptable, it is because the self-harm affects the people who witness it. And it is not nice to watch. And somehow it is also an unpleasant experience to witness, especially if you don't know what to do with it. So even though it's not acceptable from the outside, we need to understand that it is an act that is meaningful for the person concerned. And we need to understand that it is not dangerous or a problem for the person who performs it here and now. And that gives us a little time to work on. So it is a problem because the outside world, the surrounding world, thinks it is a problem. And thus it becomes a problem in the relationship, and it becomes some kind of a third element between me and you. The self-harm is here. Okay, so let's look a little into the coping strategies thing. When we recognize self-harm as a coping strategy for restoring inner balance, we also believe that the person is doing his best and that the action is meaningful for him. So that is one point. So then it becomes a kind of a coping strategy to maintain self-control. And we know that if people need to cooperate and communicate, they need to be in self-control. And that is the most significant part. All of us wants to be in self-control. We need to be in control of ourselves. And we have all these different strategies to cope with that. However, it also means that the person does not have other useful or more appropriate strategies to regulate themselves with. So the self-harming strategy is kind of the last thing. So that gives us the opportunity to think of other strategies that may have become, that we can look for on an earlier stage in the relation or in the situation where the self-harm starts, because if the self-harming is the last thing to restore inner balance and coping strategies, self-control, then there must be other strategies, other expressions that have come before that we can look for. And we do still think that self-harming is in inappropriate strategy because it gives the person problems. Tissue damage or vital organ damage, such as brains or eyes, can be permanently damaged. And then there are also the self-harming behaviors are also problematic in the relationship. So, as I said before, it becomes a third element in the encounter of the two parties. Now, Luna and I were going very good, and we thought we need a supervisor. So we called Dr. Duke Nicholas, and he's here today, and asked him if he would be our supervisor. And we were so happy to do that, because when we sent in our first draft, Duke kindly looked it through, and he said, yeah, it looks kind of, you are on the way, but I think you have to rewrite it. And that was the best thing someone ever told us, because, and then he sent us a couple of articles and said, I think you should go on the biopsychological perspective. So we did that. And in our material, we are inspired by Griffiths and Gardner, and also the Danish psychologist Bo Heilskov, who is using this biopsychosocial perspective on self-harm. So when we take this perspective into account, we move away from a linear understanding of cause, effect, action, solution, and moves towards a more holistic and a dialogical approach, but it is also a more complex approach. Because when we accept that there's a lot of different implicators, factors, and conditions that are in play when we talk about self-harming behavior, then it is not just one thing we can do something about, but then there's a lot of stuff we have to look into. And all these factors are interdependent and can relate to the self-harm. So it could, for instance, be implicators or factors that may be stressful or a burden for the person in three dimensions. So in the biomedical dimension, it could be deafblindness itself. It could be some physical impairments or chronic pain. These are just some things, you know. It could be a lot of different stuff. In the psychological dimension, it could be mental vulnerability or the limited understanding of the consequences of own behavior. And in the social and I had a problem saying environmental also on the last presentation. I'll say it again, social and environmental dimension. It could, for instance, be over or understimulation, communicative misunderstandings, absence of secure and good relationships, for instance. And all these things are integrated and infect each other and are interdependent, and then we see the self-harm. In the biopsychosocial perspective, it has two layers. So we have the basic implications or vulnerabilities that are constant and are present in longer terms of period of times. And they causes a kind of a basic level of stress and anxiety or inattention. It could be the diagnosis or executive difficulties or communication difficulties. And then we have some triggering or contribution factors on conditions, and they are situated in the here and now. And they kind of triggers the self-harm. And that could be, for instance, visual or audio noise, holidays or parties, lack of sleep, sudden changes in staff, broken structure, lack of predictability, and so on. So when we have these, we have to uncover the individual's stress factors, both biological, psychological, and socially. And we have to look into which influence of the self-harming behavior they have. And there's a countless of different implications and factors. tons of them. So, and they are all individual. So what is a burden for me is not necessarily a burden for you. So, yeah. We also developed a kind of a balloon metaphor to understand this internal imbalance, or discomfort, or tension. Oh, here it is. I was a little too fast in my notes. And we used the balloon metaphor to understand how the complexity of different basic vulnerabilities and triggering conditions and the inner state balance or discomfort and tension affect each other and are interdependent. At the X, we find the basic stress factors or triggering conditions, and up the Y-axis, we have this experiences amount of imbalances or tension. And the balloon kind of illustrates the total amount of stress caused by different basics and triggering conditions that the person needs to cope with. So the higher the complexity it is, the higher the tension will be. And then at some extent, we need to let air out of the balloon. And then maybe we self-harm and we go down a little, so it goes like this. So it expands and contracts or decreases all the time like a breath, but to some point it is so tense that it needs to let out some air. And then we see the self-harming. So with all this in mind, that was what I said, it was our kind of understanding. We made a intervention model that we called the SOS intervention model. SOS is an international emergency signal, but it is also a Danish acronym for co-creating self-harm. So the model is inspired by research, action research cycle, and it goes through 5 actions, or actually 6 actions. And we want to investigate the phenomenon and get more knowledge before we jump to fast conclusions. Because as staff, when we see a challenge or a problem or something, we tend to jump very fast to conclusions and say, we'll do this. But here we offer an opportunity to investigate it before we go to fast conclusions, jump to fast conclusions. But when we see self-harm, of course, we have to act on it here and now. So the heart kind of symbolizes the first action that we need to offer the guy who is or the woman or the child who is self-harming. Some kind of relief here now. So we will never stop them. We will never ask them to stop, because that is just another burden. If we put demands on them that they should stop something that regulate or restore an intention, and we say, oh, don't do that. So we don't stop them, we don't grab them and say, don't do that, but we may give them something that can give a relief here now, maybe a change of condition, maybe something to drink or to eat. Maybe we just have to back off, and let go of it. So, or if they sit alone, maybe we should offer some contact or some social interaction. Maybe they are bored. So the here and now relief are very important, but we also have to understand that it is not a quick fix when we work on self-harming behaviors. So we need to investigate what is going on with this person. So we jump to the data collection action. So here we collect data, both the prevalence, when, so the time of the day, week, or month, and also the type of self-harming. So is it a bite or hitch or pitch or something? And then we create also an overview over the basic vulnerabilities and triggering conditions that the person needs to cope with. So we make this big paper on that one. Then we go to the analysis and we look for patterns and on different contexts where the self-harm occurs. And then start to make some hypotheses or actions to take. But we also analyze all the good situations where the self-harm is not happening. So what do we know about all these good situations where the self-harm is not happening? So what is present there? What do we know about that? Is there anything we know about these situations that we could use also in the situations where we do see the self-harm? And then we start planning interventions, and we share our hypothesis and co-create new knowledge together with our colleagues so that we can plan the new interventions together, because the intervention stuff is something that we have to do, all of us. Then we try out the interventions and collect new data, and finally we evaluate on the action taking. So that is the model. And it is a shared responsibility, because it is important for the process that all staff cooperates and kind of find it meaningful to do. So they have to support the process and follow the interventions. Because it is the total amount of knowledge and the total amount of interventions that can make a difference for the individual. So we don't make just one intervention. We make a lot of different small things. We tried out, so we were writing on this book, and we created this model, and then we tried it out in practice because we wanted to see, is it any good before we have the book for print. Some of the results from the supervision was that after 2 months with the new interventions, the self-harming was reduced in all 3 cases. So we had 3 cases, and for each case there was 3 or 4 colleagues working together, both from daycare and school and also from the living units. So after 2 months, with the new interventions, the self-harming was reduced in all 3 cases. And the team supported the intervention began to talk about self-harm in different manners. They recognized it as a strategy, and they started to look for other strategies that the person used to protect himself or to maintain his self-control. So that was the strategies that comes before the self-harm itself, because that is the last one. And also the understanding that people is always doing their best really helped the staff to take the perspective of the individual, asking themselves, what would he or say was important if they sat here with us at the table? And I think that is a question we should always ask if we are not able to ask them ourselves. So if the person is right here next to me, what would he say was important in life for him? Or since he used his self-harm, what is important for him? And maybe we will find some answers on how to do the intervention. And the teams wanted actually to see if the model also can work when we work with challenging behavior. And in this autumn, we'll try that out. So what did the participants say about the intervention program or the supervision program? So we asked them, so what was the coolest ride during the supervision? And they said, when I realized how important it is to focus on self-harm and how often it occurs. Another one said, when we spotted a lot of competences in the person. Or when my colleagues united and collaborated on the project. Or when I reflected on previous and successful episodes with the person, which inspired me to take new actions. Or when I experienced that I could prevent a situation with self-harm by being present and accessible. And then we asked, what can you do now that you could not do before? And they said, I'm much better to interpret her signals. I have a better understanding of his needs for quiet activities in the afternoons. I have a better plan to structure. I can plan a better structure for him and interpret his signals. I can now introduce activities from his level of stress and not from what I thought could be cool to do. So I think that is really taking the personal perspective of the person with deafblindness, that she actually started to introduce activities from his level of stress and not from what she thought would be cool. And then, what were your best experiences from the supervision? And they said the systematically data collection and documentation quickly created an overview of over the self-harm and the efforts taken. And they also discovered that a small effort can make a big difference, and that the self-harm almost disappeared, and that the SOS intervention model was quite easy to use. And then we asked, so after this supervision, what will you never do again? And they said, I will never ever again leave her alone when she self-harms, or we will never neglect self-harm again. So I thought that was quite some strong, statements that they came with. So what did, so I just want to highlight before we go into discussion. So we consider self-harm as coping strategy. The person is always doing his best. When we take a biopsychological perspective on it, then we find a lot of stuff that we can do. When we investigate the phenomenon, we investigate the phenomenon before we jump to conclusions, and that it is the total amount of interventions that make a difference for the individual, and that self-harm is a shared responsibility. And I just want to show you the book. It is in Danish right now, but we were so lucky that we, a month ago, won a prize for our work, and we gained a lot of money. So now we are able to translate it into English. So it will be translated into English and available later in the autumn. So I'm very happy about that. Yes, so I have now some questions for you. I asked you to come up, and that I would not ask you directly, but I will ask you some. So if we in the room today go with the premises that we recognize self-harm as a coping strategy for restoring inner balance, we also do believe that the person is doing his best. So which possibilities for new action does this approach give you? So please, some of you sit together 2 and 2, just reflect on a little on that together, and we'll come back in a couple of minutes.
So want them to respond, right?
Yeah. So go ahead and discuss it a little. Maybe you will respond, maybe you will not, but I think a shared reflection is good. Oh.
It's coming. Okay.
Yeah.
Getting a microphone, so I have a big voice, right? So, dude? Oh, I'm sorry.
They have to
Helen,
discuss
I was
it a
not
little.
listening.
We have 6 minutes, so we can discuss just for a few minutes before we ask someone.
Okay,
Jerry?
discuss it
Yeah.
amongst yourself.
It's nice to talk to each other before you raise a question or a comment in public. Okay, so if anyone has something they want to share what you discussed. please speak up or raise your hand. Yeah.
You do. This off? No. Hello? There you go.
I guess I don't really have anything specific related to that question, but it's just been interesting to listen because it's almost like we've gone through the entire process without the science behind it and all the research and it's the same outcome. And it's just really nice to see that. It's like, I feel like I could almost write a book based on everything you shared in the exact same process without all of your research and science behind it. And it's been extremely successful for us.
That is so good to hear.
Yeah,
so,
it's almost brought tears to my eyes because we're so proud of the work we've done with this individual. And we work with a lot of behavior therapists and we have behavior support plans and we try to keep everybody on the same track. And it's just like everything's just super real life for what you talked about today. So it was really great to
that's good
hear
to
that.
hear.
So and I can't wait till the book comes out in English so I can read it.
So this, when we start to focus on it and look at it, take a different perspective and look behind and figure out what is going on, why is he doing it? Not what is the single cause, but the amount of stuff that he's challenged with.
And it's super hard to talk about with new staff and new people and new stuff. But I've been working with this individual for many, many years. And I mean, I'm an intervener and I'm a professional with him, but I'm not like a book professional or a scientist or a doctor, but it's almost like I can just, like I was part of your study, even though I wasn't.
And I guess this is because this is not, research. This is just evidence-based kind of,
Absolutely.
What can we do from a pedagogical point of view?
Yeah, and you don't see enough research. Like we struggled with finding any sort of research with autism, deafblindness, and self-harm because it's been pretty intense with this particular individual. So
thank you so much for sharing.
Anybody else we have time for one more? Yes, please.
Hello, thank you for that. Lilius, my name's Lilius. I'm the mother of a young man with congenital deafblindness. Self-injurious behaviour has been a major feature of Fergus's life, and the people around him supporting him, becoming from a behavioural approach to it, were seeing this behaviour and seeing it as something that had to be stopped. And in schools and youth clubs, it was always stop doing that, and that would make it worse. No, don't do that. Physical interventions were brought in to actually restrain him. The self-injurious behaviour went so far at a time where I was not understanding it that he detached retinas in both his eyes. He's been left with not even light perception in the right eye, tiny little bit of residual vision in the left eye. But the turning point was when I started to learn more about congenital deafblindness, looking at it as a communicative act. And when, instead of looking at it as behavior that needed to be stopped, I approached it as, what are you trying to say to me? And in fact, it had started with a tap, I'll stand up, a tap on his chin, which was what he used for more or help me with something. But if he wasn't listened to, it would go up here, and then it would get harder, and it was his equivalent of going, excuse me, could you help me? Help me. And then he would tear his glasses off and punch himself in the eyes, and that was him shouting for help, or that's how I interpreted it. And suddenly people came running, and he learned very quickly that this extreme action got attention, and then somebody would somehow try and solve the problem he had. And that then became very communicative because that had people coming running to him. And I've been working trying to get the support support teams around him to understand that what he's doing, there's far more to it than this, but a simplistic approach is look at it as I'm trying to tell you I need something. It could be something physical, I can't reach you've moved my cup and I'm thirsty and I can't find it, or it could be I'm overstimulated and I need you to bring in the strategies around my calming, rebalancing approaches. It could be anything, but it's a cry, it's a communicative act. And when you turn it around and look at it as, what are you trying to tell me? That changes the whole perspective, and it gets the people around him starting to look at him from his perspective as a person who lives in the bodily tactile modality.
Thank you for that, Lilias. We have some literature. It's we just took out a little of it, but else, thank you from here.
Okay, we're at our time now, and let me say, please join me in thanking Helle for sharing her knowledge and about something that is critical, and it's something that I see every day in my practice all over the world, and I think that this type of research really or practice needs to continue for us to understand more and more, and thank you so much. So join me in thanking Helle. And on behalf of DBI, this is Margaret. Thank you.
If you could just sit for a shot.
Sit for a...
I just want to send to my family that, there's...
That people are interested.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I'm sure you could talk to Helle here. Now, we're going to take a 15-minute stretch break, and then everybody is going to join us back here for the next plenary, okay? So we'll see you in 15 minutes.